and we're done. Now let's take a look at E. In E, we have 5x squared plus 7x equals 0. Now, we are set up perfectly because we have an x squared term. We know that everything has to be on one side and the other side has to be 0. We are set up perfectly. However, notice that this time we still want to do what we've been doing. We want to factor now. But notice there aren't 3 terms, there are only 2. So we can't do AC method for the first time. However, what we should be doing is going back to what's the first thing we always check for no matter what. What do they have in common? Well, notice, what do they have in common? What is their greatest common factor? Is that they both have an x. So I can factor out an x from each piece. Now, factoring out one of the x's will still leave me with a 5 and an x left on the first piece, but will only leave me with the 7 on the second piece. And we just need to bring down our equals 0 so we don't lose it. However, now the question is, what do we do next? It is factored. So we're almost done. We don't have to do much. We've just got to take our first factor, which is relatively simple, our x, and set that equal to 0. And then we have to take our second factor, not as simple, the 5x plus 7, and set that equal to 0. So 5x plus 7 has to also get set equal to 0. Well, what's nice about this first answer, x equals 0, is it's already done. So we don't need to do anything with that. However, the second equation, the 5x plus 7 needs to be solved for x, so I need to finish this one off. We'll start by subtracting 7 from both sides, and that will give us, let's see, a 5x equals negative 7. Then the next step is we'll divide both sides by 5. And that gets us that x equals negative 7/5. So we still ended up with 2 answers. Either x equals 0 will make your equation 0, or x equals negative 7/5 also can make your equation 0. Both are answers, and again, we should be getting 2 answers because our original problem was the highest exponent was squared, or 2. Let's take a look at F. In F, we have, let's see, 9x squared minus 49 equals 0. Again, we've got an x squared term, so it means that everything needs to be on the left-hand side where the other side is 0, which we already have. The other side is 0. Everything's on the left-hand side. Once we're set up like that, we can factor. Notice again, we don't have 3 terms, we only have 2. However, notice unlike the last one in E, we don't have anything in common. So the question becomes, how do you factor things that have 2 terms where there's nothing in common? Remember, it's going to be either squares or it's going to be cubes. And in this case, I see the exponent of 2, so it's going to be squares. So we need to figure out what's squared in each piece here. Well, we've got a 9x squared. Well, what's squared is a 3 and an x. We also have a 49, let's see. A 49, and that is 7 squared. So when we go to factor this guy, remember how squares work. Is the 3x will go in both positions. The 7 will also go in both positions. It's just remember with the difference, remember it's the difference of 2 squares because of the subtraction. One ends up being a plus and one ends up being a minus, and we will keep the equal 0 on the other side. That is completely factored. Now once you hit this stage, it doesn't change. We need to set both pieces equal to 0. So we're going to be setting a 3x plus 7 equal to 0 and a 3x minus 7 equal to 0. So to solve the first equation, we'll start by subtracting 7 from both sides. And let's see, that will get me a 3x equals negative 7. And let's see, dividing both sides by a 3. That will get me that x equals negative 7/3 for my first equation. Then looking at my second equation, we need to do the exact same thing, except for we need to start by adding the 7 to both sides, which gets me now a 3x equals positive 7. Then we can divide both sides by 3, which will get me that x equals a positive 7/3. So I'm getting two answers just like before because we're squared as our highest exponent, is that x either equals negative 7/3 or positive 7/3. Let's take a look at g. In g, we've got a negative 2x squared plus 8 equals 0. Now, again, just like the last couple, we do already have something that equals 0, which is super important because we do have an x squared term, so we are set up properly. However, what we need to look at first is what do they have in common? Well, we have a 2 and an 8, which are both divisible by 2, so I can factor out a 2. But our first term is negative, so I'm actually going to pull out a negative 2 from both terms. So dividing out or pulling out the negative 2 from both terms will still leave me with an x squared, but dividing the negative 2 into the positive 8 will leave me with a negative 4. And notice we don't want to lose the equal 0, so we're going to kind of bring that down so we don't forget what we're doing here. Continuing, we have our negative 2 as our GCF that we don't want to lose. That's out in front, so let's kind of bring that down for a while. However, notice what we have that's left that we still need to continue factoring is this x squared minus 4. Well, notice two terms. We've got a minus in the middle. And I do see a squared as an exponent. Means we're looking at a difference of squares here. Remember with two terms, it's either squares or cubes. Here we've got squares again. What's squared here in the first piece is just an x. What's squared in the second piece is just a 2. So remember, how do we factor squares? Is we'll start out with the x and end with the 2 in both pieces. But remember that in order to get that minus sign in the middle, is one needs to be a plus and one needs to be a minus. And this was an equation where the whole thing equals 0. So far, so good. As a reminder, though, how many answers should I be getting? I should be getting 2 because the highest exponent was a squared. Now, you may be saying, well, I've got 1, 2, 3 pieces. Well, remember, you can only solve a piece for x if there's actually an x in it. One of these 3 pieces does not have an x in it. Notice the first piece is just the number negative 2. So we can't really set that equal to 0. If we set negative 2 equal to 0, it makes no sense. There's no x to actually solve, so that doesn't help. What we actually are caring about is setting the other 2 equations equal to 0. The x plus 2 needs to be set equal to 0, and the x minus 2 needs to be set equal to 0. So we can solve those 2 equations, and the first one will subtract 2 from both sides. And let's see what happens there. We will get an x equals negative 2. And on the second equation, we're going to add 2 to both sides, and let's see what that will do for us. That will get us an x equals something very similar. X equals positive 2, and those are our 2 answers. Either x is going to be negative 2 or positive 2, and we're done. We did get our 2 answers because our equation is squared.